There are letters you send, and letters you never do. Some words weigh too much to be mailed. You can feel it in the quiet of her room, the kind of silence that hums with all the things she never said. The lamp on her desk flickers softly, throwing long shadows across a stack of untouched papers. Outside, the rain whispers against the windowpane, as if even the world has learned to tread lightly around her grief. Her name is Alara. She sits there, hunched over a sheet of pale paper, her pen trembling in her hand. Every stroke feels hesitant, as though the ink itself resists the truth she's trying to write. Her fingers tighten, and for a moment, she closes her eyes, breathing in the scent of old paper and memory. Then, with a shaky exhale, she begins. The first word bleeds into the page, Daniel. It's not the first time she's written his name, but tonight it feels final, like the closing of a door she's kept open far too long. The ink runs as her tears fall, tracing fragile rivers across her apology. You can almost hear her whisper through the hush of the room, "I'm sorry, Daniel." The words hang there, heavy, fragile, too late. On the table beside her sits a book, worn, frayed at the edges, its spine softened by years of being open to the same chapter. The Places We Leave Behind. It was their book once. Margins filled with Daniel's handwriting, little notes and underlines, fragments of a love once alive in its pages. She glances at it now, the corners of her mouth twitching with something that might have been a smile, once. The letter is nearly done. She reads it over, her lips moving soundlessly through the confessions, the things she said, the things she never meant to say, the silences that grew between them until they became walls. Every line carries years of what-ifs. The paper shakes as she folds it, neat, deliberate, reverent. She slides it gently into the heart of the book, pressing it between the pages like a fragile relic. For a moment, her hands linger there, unwilling to let go. It feels too much like losing him all over again. But then, something shifts, a stillness, a surrender. She exhales, long and slow, and sets the book down on the table. The rain outside grows steadier, and for the first time in a long while, she doesn't flinch at the sound. Tomorrow, she'll place the book in a donation box. Tomorrow, someone else might find it. Maybe they'll open it, maybe they won't. It doesn't matter. Because this isn't about being found. It's about release. It's about finally speaking the words that have haunted her in silence. And as the light fades from the room, her voice drifts through the quiet one last time, fragile yet resolute. What if forgiveness doesn't come from being forgiven, but from finally letting go? I have watched Alara for years the way someone watches the tide, patient, knowing that the water will come and go and that each return rearranges the sand in ways you may not notice until you step barefoot and feel the new contours underfoot. She is 30-something, the kind of age that looks older in small towns because the horizon is close and every memory fits neatly into the spaces between shutters and porches. Once she wrote like someone gathering light, stories that breathed, sentences that curled into other people's lives and warmed them for a while. There are old reviews tucked into boxes in the back room of the library that still praise her name. There are emails she never replies to, invitations she declines with the polite smallness of someone who believes her story has ended. Now she moves like a bookmark through her own life, placed, left, found again. Mornings begin at the library where salt and paper share the same thin smell, where the bell above the door sounds like an admission, and she sorts the day into neat sections: fiction, reference, local history, shelving patience between spines. She smiles at the regulars, but it is the polite smile of someone practicing a script she has memorized. Even the way she feeds her cat, the small, ritualistic clink of the tin, the drifting of kibble into a bowl, feels like a rehearsal for a life she used to write about with abandon. There is a silence around her that people misread for composure but that I know is heavy with untold sentences, like letters left unsent in a drawer that has forgotten how to close. When the light is right, late afternoon, the kind of sun that comes slanted through blinds and throws the dust into being, her face softens and the world remembers she was once someone who laughed easily. The memory of laughter is what keeps her from untethering entirely. There are days when she pulls down a book and finds a margin note in a handwriting she knows as well as the lines on her own palm. Daniel's handwriting is a ghost in ink, curved, impatient, certain. He loved lists and underlines and whole sentences circled as if by circling them he could make them keep living. I have watched her read those marginalia as if they were relics, turning the pages slowly, eyes catching on his loops as though catching at a rope. The flashbacks come like wine through an open window, warm afternoons on a park bench, his shoulder brushed against hers, their knees touching by coincidence, the way he read poetry aloud so that even the pigeons seemed to hush. They had a language of small intimacies, a shared pastry, a book traded like a promise, the kind of laughter that left the air shimmering. Once they stayed up until the sky purpled and made lists of the places they swore they'd go to, the cities that would hold them together. Those memories are golden and dangerous because they make knowing what followed feel sharper. The betrayal is not cinematic, there are no raised voices in public squares, no smashed plates. It was quieter, as subtle and thorough as wrought. A lie, or the lack of one, a secret kept with the stubbornness of self-protection, a decision that in the moment seemed small but was a wedge when left unchecked. She told herself it was to spare him, to keep the edges soft. He interpreted the silence as absence, and absence began to fill itself with assumptions. I have seen how a single misaligned sentence can become a chasm when the other person is already poised to fall. There was a night when she left his apartment with the hope that time would mend the misunderstanding. She left a note she thought would explain without reopening, and the next morning the apartment smelled of coffee and the chair was empty. He left without a goodbye, or maybe the goodbye was in the way he stopped returning calls, in the way the photo frames went bare. The worst part was not his leaving but the way she discovered his departure, the slow realization in the bookcase where his marks stopped, the way his handwriting dried up like a spring cut off. For months she moved through the town like someone carrying an ember, terrified that if she tilted it wrong the flame would go out and take with it any chance of light. The town itself has a geometry of grief. It is a coastal place where gulls argue with the wind and the streets remember everyone's business. Houses are close enough that secrets travel under laundry lines. The bookstore where she now works smells of brine and binding glue. Time here moves like a watch with a loose spring. There is a kind of permanence that makes mistakes feel like property you cannot easily dispose of. Weather is a character, rain that arrives in long slow sentences, fog that swallows horizons and makes every return seem like a loop. Elara's world mirrors this weather, muted tones in the wallpaper, blinds half closed to keep the light from reminding her what was once bright, rain that drums a metronome against the roof and keeps her company when sleep will not. Even the people who pass her in the market carry the same hushed cadence, as though the town has learned to speak softly to avoid waking its regrets. The inciting moment is quiet, nearly domestic, a kind of revelation that arrives between shelving and closing time. She is cleaning an old shelf, dusting with care, fingers trailing along spines until they catch on a book she knows by the feel of it before she reads the title. The cover of The Places We Leave Behind is softened by years of handling. It sits there under a layer of dust like a relic. When she opens it, the pages sigh and a photograph slips out, two faces, young and luminous, sunlight cresting behind them so that they appear surrounded by flame. They are smiling the way people do before promises calcify into bargains. A note falls with the photograph, a scrawl in Daniel's hand that says, "Keep this one safe." She stares at the photo until the rectangles of the present blur. The finding is not an accident, it is the universe aligning its props so she cannot ignore what she has been evading. That night, the storm outside is steady, and she sits with the book across her knees as if the weight between them might be a bridge. The letter begins as an attempt at explanation but becomes an excavation, apologies unearthed, loves catalogued, the kind of honest confession that demands to be heard even if no one is left to hear it. She writes as though each word is a pebble dropped into the water of her chest, watching the ripples spread until the surface calms. She writes because she needs to know she can still make sentences that matter and because silence, she has learned, is merely a louder way of speaking the things you cannot bear to say. I have watched her write and understood then that this letter is less about changing the past than about changing how she carries it. She folds the paper with the meticulous gentleness of someone who is both mourning and mending, and when she speaks the line aloud, soft, almost to herself, I hear it like a benediction. I thought silence would protect me. But silence only grew louder. I have watched the letter sit inside her like a held breath, and in the days that followed it seemed to thrum against her ribs the way a trapped bird thrashes against the bars of a cage. The question of sending it was not a momentary flicker but a slow fever that crept through mornings and afternoons, into the quiet hours of night. Each day she returned to the desk as if to a liturgy, paper before her, pen uncapped, and she tried on voices the way people try on coats when weather refuses to decide. There was the first draft, sharp, almost surgical, every sentence a scalpel meant to cut away excuses. That one flared with the heat of anger, accusations folded into apology, sentences that wanted restitution more than contrition. It read like a courtroom plea, the kind of cold clarity that insists on right and wrong. She set that version aside because after she read it aloud the words felt like stones she could not carry back, they would only bruise whatever tenderness remained. The second draft melted the edges. It was tender and explanatory, generous with images and soft with the pronouns that made it intimate. In that version she catalogued memories like offerings, recited the small things, how he laughed at the wrong beats in songs, how his spoon always stuck out from the cereal bowl, the way his thumb smudged ink on the margins of poems. That one broke her purposely, drew out the grief in measured, aching lines. She rewrote that one too because it felt like bargaining. If she told the story correctly, if she salted it with enough regret, then perhaps the ledger would balance and the universe would return what she had misplaced. There was a version that was resigned, its rhythm like someone folding their hands and accepting a fate with quiet dignity. It ended with the kind of sentences that close a door and leave the hall silent, no begging, no pleading, only the acceptance of consequence. Every iteration of, "I'm sorry," gathered new sediment. The phrase changed shape under her hand. Sometimes it meant responsibility, sometimes it meant sorrow, sometimes it meant a plea for mercy she no longer trusted she deserved. The phrase was a prism and when she turned it each way it cast a different light, revealing angles of motive and omission she had not seen. She found herself pausing over words that once seemed straightforward, forgive, remember, forget, and discovering that what she thought were synonyms were actually small revolutions in meaning. She wrote, erased, wrote again. She sealed pages in envelopes, opened them, and tore them, an economy of drafts that made the night drawer a palimpsest of regret. And all the while Daniel visited her. Not in the physical sense, he did not walk through her door or sit in the chair that still held the faint scent of his cologne, but in that peculiar way memory and imagination can be cruelly generous. She dreamed of him at odd hours, not speaking, only watching, luminous and immobile as if he were a statue she had once passed with a casual eye and now realized had been carved in her absence. In the dreams he never offered answers, sometimes he folded his hands in front of him, sometimes he walked to the window and watched the rain, sometimes he simply turned his face toward her and the world narrowed to the brief beat between heartbeats. These dreams were not consolation. They were a training ground for shame. Waking, she would find the draft stained with the residue of dream salt, impressions that made sentences curl inward. Days accreted into a strange pattern of small rituals, coffee at dawn, the library's bell, the hushed shuffling of patrons, and then the return to the desk where drafts, like unearthed bones, lay waiting for her attention. The town kept its own counsel, neighbors exchanged greetings that were smooth and practiced, like their voices had been sanded down to avoid catching on old truths. But some things in small towns happen like tidal changes, patterns repeat until something nudges them and then the old maps fail to fit the new contours. For Ilara the nudge was unremarkable in detail and seismic in consequence. She had never expected an encounter with a man who could have been him, she had quit expecting him entirely. It happened at the train station, that indifferent maw of departures and brief reunions where people arrive and unarrive in cycles. She went to town that afternoon for a listless errand, postcards to send, a return to the library's archive, but the station called her back with the raw, electric hush it always had when trains were due. The platform was a place of small, orchestrated chaos. Suitcases rolled like obedient beasts, children clutched at parents' hands, an elderly couple argued in a language that was mostly affection. She saw him, or she saw a man who could have been him, across the tracks, leaning against a pillar with his coat collar turned up against wind that smelled of salt. For a breath she forgot to count the heartbeats. The world shrank so that the air between them felt like a stage. He moved the way Daniel used to move, the tilt of head, the half-smile practiced for private jokes, the way he tapped his fingers in time with some unheard rhythm. She followed with the awful impatience of someone hoping to be saved by an act that might never come. The pursuit was quiet and clumsy, weaving through the crowd, a step, then another, the deliberate attempt to seem casual while her insides ran a sprint. She imagined approaching him, voice steadied by the letter hidden in her bag, an apology perfected on paper, a reconciliation shaped by the years of regret that had aged like wine in a cellar. She imagined saying his name and watching his face fold into the same recognition she carried inside her. But the man stepped onto a different train, and though she kept pace for a while, his profile receded into the carriage like a promise being withdrawn. At the next stop she saw the door slide shut on him and the train pull away, and in that instant the truth was a small, sensible thing: it was not Daniel. It was only someone who shared one measure of his features, a coincidence given the cruel courtesy of fate. She remained on the platform, hands empty and breath thick with a disappointment that felt both ridiculous and cataclysmic. The encounter boiled the ocean of her indecision into a single, concentrated sadness. Afterwards, the internal war intensified rather than eased. The station scene did not bring clarity. It brought a sharpening. Should she look for him, really look, or should she finally let the search go? To search would be to reopen everything, it would be to insist that his response be the arbiter of her peace. To let go would mean risking the accusation that she had abandoned accountability to the whims of forgetfulness. There were nights when she sat at the window and imagined him reading the letter, imagined him smiling, imagined an answer arriving like mail. There were other nights when the same window offered only the reflection of a woman who had, perhaps, held on too long. Questions piled like unfiled books. Would he even want to revisit the past? Had he forgiven her already, or had he simply moved on in the only way people sometimes must, by forgetting? If he had foregone the weight of her confession, would her apology be a needless reopening of a healed wound? The moral calculus of her choice was as personal as prayer and as public as reckoning. In the solitude of her apartment she rehearsed scenarios with the obsessive logic of someone trying to anticipate the weather of another person's soul. Each scenario required assumptions about him she did not have the right to make. How do you measure another person's capacity for mercy? How do you appraise the sincerity of a forgiveness you might never witness? And beneath the practical concerns, there was the gnawing ethical question: was she reaching for absolution from him because she truly sought his peace, or because she needed to purchase her own with someone else's stamp? Her dreams and her waking thoughts conspired into a pressure that made the pages of the drafts feel like currency in an economy she no longer understood. She tried to dismantle the need to be seen, to be forgiven, to be absolved by external validation, tried to reframe the act of writing as private expiation, a litany offered to herself rather than to him. But still the drafts multiplied, each new one nuanced by the residue of the one before. Sometimes she would read aloud and the sound of her voice would betray the heartbeat behind a sentence, sometimes she would whisper and the words would evaporate into the apartment like breath on glass. The candle was an act of both defiance and ceremony. She bought it on a whim, the kind of purchase that feels less like retail and more like arranging a small altar. Its wax was ivory and the wick stubbornly black. She sat at her desk, the drafts fanned out, the book between her knees, and struck the match. The flame leapt, throwing a brief and flattering light across her face, turning the room into a small, sacred theater. For a long time she did not touch the letter to the flame. She held it between two fingers and watched the match gutter and die, leaving a tendril of smoke to curl toward the ceiling like a white flag. The candle's glow made the ink look too alive, the sentences seemed to breathe, animate and culpable. With the letter balanced over the flame, she felt for a moment as if the choice were obvious: burn it, and the past is consumed, neat and irreversible. But something in her resisted. She could not bring herself to reduce those phrases to ash, to watch the sorrow she had finally confessed turn into smoke and be carried away by a breeze that did not care. The flame chimed her indecision: flicker, steady, flicker, and she watched it until her eyes filled with the kind of tiredness that belongs to people who have been awake for too long with the same question. She exhaled and the small plume of breath went out across the candle as if it, too, had been charged with the authority to decide. She blew, and the light went out. Darkness pooled, not like relief but like the quiet after a bell tolls in an empty church. The letter remained whole in her fingers, its edges uncharred, its words intact. She could have fed it to the flame again, she could have taken out the address and walked to a mailbox and let the nation of post decide its fate. Instead she sat in the dark and felt the weight of all her drafts pressed gently against her palms. She could not destroy what she had finally allowed herself to create. The flame had done what none of her drafts could, it had asked her to choose, and when she failed to seal the act with heat, she found that the failure was also a kind of decision. She could not destroy it, yet. I held the book in my hands like a relic, feeling the familiar give of its spine as if the paper inside were a palm with the map of a life. When Alara found the places we leave behind tucked in a donation bin, when she first traced Daniel's looping handwriting in the margins and let the memory of sunlight and laughter pour back into her like rain, she did not imagine that the next step would lead her to a woman who knew him better than she thought she ever could. Maya's name came to her like an address written on the inside of a coat, an old friend of Daniel's, someone who had worked at a cafe he favored, or perhaps a co-worker at his old job. It did not matter that the route to Maya felt like walking through fog, the map she held now made all the detours count. Maya lived in a narrow house where the porch leaned with the age of someone who had given more to others than to maintenance. When Alara knocked, the door opened with an ease that suggested both welcome and habit. Maya was younger than Alara remembered, the same quick eyes, the same small freckle by the temple, but there was an economy of movement now, the kind people develop after grief has refined what must be kept and what may be let go. She greeted Alara with a tea smile and a look that was both curious and already knowing, the way people who have been present at the margins of other people's lives sometimes are. For a moment they stood there as if on the lip of a shared script, two women whose scenes had once intersected with a man who preferred to live his life in the margins of books. They spoke at first of small things, weather, the state of the town, the new exhibit at the library, while the core of the visit pulsed just beneath the politeness like a hidden engine. Then Maya's hand found the book when Alara reached for it, and the conversation shifted as quietly as a page turning. Maya touched the inside gently, like someone who understands the rightness of reverence. She did not need to ask why Alara had come. The color left her face the way a shadow does when a cloud slides over the sun. He kept it, Maya said simply, and the words landed with the bluntness of a dropped cup. He kept your book. He always kept things that mattered. The revelation came in stages, like a photograph developing in a tray of water. Maya told stories in tiny flashes, Daniel's ritual of tucking notes into books, the way he would circle sentences and write single words in the margins, the way he used bookmarks that were often receipts from cafes or bus tickets from places he said he might one day take someone. She spoke of a small accident 3 winters ago, the kind that towns talk about in hushed tones until the memory thickens into lore. Daniel had been driving home one evening in the rain, a truck on the opposite lane hydroplaned. The crash was sudden, the kind of sudden that leaves a geography of absence. People said the roads were slick that night, that the lights were bad, that everyone drove too fast for a way that had no forgiveness to offer. Maya's voice did not tremble when she said his name, but the room around them rearranged itself to accommodate the absence. Alara's first reaction was disbelief, grotesque and immediate, as if hearing a poem misread aloud. She thought perhaps Maya meant someone else, a cousin, a friend, not the Daniel she had loved. But Maya's hands, dark with the rings of a woman who had loved and been loved, rested on the page with a steadiness that convinced her. He kept your letter, Maya said then, and the second pronouncement was more like an incantation than news. He kept it between the pages of that book the night he left to drive through the storm. There was a small, terrible elegance to the way Daniel had preserved her words. He had not read them and closed the book, he had not ignored them and tossed the pages aside. He had put them where he could return to them, a place one uses when one intends, somewhere to find solace, somewhere to remember. Maya told Alara that in the days after the crash, during the search through the car and through the things that belonged to him, someone on the emergency crew had found the book. Inside it they had found a folded sheet, edges softened with the breath of time. It had been neither burned nor destroyed. He had not read the confession aloud in the way Alara imagined forgiveness might be enacted. But before the accident, he had left a single line in ink, written in the exact handwriting she had known: "Some letters never need answers." It is a sentence that looks small on paper and enormous once heard. Maya said it with the cautious reverence of someone reciting scripture. Alara felt the letters land inside her like pebbles, one after another, a little percussion that made the water ripple in her. Some letters never need answers. The phrase did more than settle an old question, it reframed the architecture of a life she had been living under the weight of doubt. It was not a neat absolution in the form she had imagined, not a returned letter with pencil annotations of forgiveness, nor a voice on the lines saying, "It's okay." It was something else, something that had filled the space she had worried over with a kind of quiet, a decision, perhaps, Daniel had made in private, to carry what she had written as a companion rather than as a petition. Once Alara understood, truly understood, the deliberate ordinariness of the act, something shifted. Daniel had not needed to answer because he had answered in the only way he could, by making room for the letter inside himself. He had not cast her apology aside, he had taken it in and kept it close. The thought was both a balm and a knife. Would that he had spoken it in a voice she could have heard, would that she had heard before the accident and perhaps let words find their space between them while both were living. But the knowledge that he had sheathed her apology within the intimate geography of his favorite book, that knowledge afforded her a kind of grace she had not expected to earn. Grief rearranges priorities with the unceremonious efficiency of a housekeeper on a tight schedule. It creates pockets where once there were none and removes things from prominence that had once been central. For Alara, the twist of this revelation was not only that Daniel had kept her letter but also that his keeping it meant he had forgiven, or at least accepted. The guilt she had carried was reoriented. It was not a debt waiting to be repaid at his convenience, it was a burden she had been transporting alone because she had believed it should be his to lift. The moral calculus changed. If Daniel had already, in his own private way, placed her words in the sanctuary of his book, then the act of seeking his outward forgiveness would become, at best, redundant and at worst, an intrusion into the way he had chosen to live with what he could not change. The unraveling truth created a ripple of consequences she had not considered. If he had forgiven her in the quiet architecture of his life, what then was left for her to do? The question was not rhetorical, it required action different from anything she had yet attempted. The letter had been written as an appeal, as a way to free herself by asking to be freed. But if the act of placing the confession into the world was not about receiving absolution from the person she had hurt but rather about her sanctioning of her own heart, then the task before her became more internal and less dramatic. She could not ask him, not because the ask was impossible but because the person who mattered, the repository of her fear and longing, was gone. Forgiveness, if it could be called that, had already been performed by the other party in the only space he had left for it. Her responsibility, then, was not to the dead but to the living shape of herself. Maya's words kept looping like a refrain in her mind: some letters never need answers. The sentence multiplied in consequence, becoming a mirror and a threshold. Alara went home with the book under her arm, but the pages of the story had rearranged themselves. She sat at her kitchen table, the kettle whistling as if urging her to take in the steam of this new knowledge. She read her own letter once more, aloud this time, and the cadence of the words sounded different in the air. Without the imagined response to shape them, the phrases belonged to her, pure, undemanding, honest. Where before each line had been a plea, now they read as confession and self-inquiry. Where once they had been a purchase intended to buy back a damaged past, now they felt like an inventory of what she had been and what she might yet choose to become. The truth is a strange thing. It can free you by revealing that the prison you have been guarding is mostly built of your own fear. Once she understood Daniel's unspoken reply, the nature of the prison changed. Elara recognized that she had conflated being forgiven with being absolved publicly. She had imagined a scene, his eyes softening, his voice rounding the apology into acceptance. Instead, she found a private act of retention, a quiet guardianship of her words. It was not spectacle, it was devotion. He had not needed to speak in order to perform mercy. He had arranged the space of his life to include the presence of what she had said, and in that arrangement he had, in effect, answered. But this knowledge also returned to her a different, harder question. If the person you hurt is gone, who do you seek forgiveness from now? It is not only about whose permission you need to move on, it is about what you owe to yourself and to the absent other. Forgiveness, she realized, does not necessarily need to be transactional. It can be an internal reformation where you reconfigure your own relationship to fault and consequence. Or it can be an offering placed back into the world in some small way that honors the memory of the person you wronged without demanding anything from them. For Elara, the revelation suggested a third possibility, that forgiveness might be a covenant you make not with the person you hurt, but with the community of living things that inherit the space where that person once stood. Once the shock softened into understanding, Elara began to see actions where before there had been only hesitation. She could keep the book in a place where Daniel's marginalia would be preserved, or she could return it to the donation box as a deliberate gesture of release, an act that would honor both the letter and his quiet decision to carry it. Each option felt like an ethic. To preserve was to respect history, to release was to perform mercy both for herself and for him. The moral logic she had been carrying, the ledger of wrongs and rights, dissolved into choices that were less about absolution and more about integrity. The hour that marked the act's completion did not come with fanfare. There was no thunderclap, no final line delivered with cinematic timing. Instead, in the sober light of the afternoon, she folded the letter again and slid it back into the book. Her hands were steadier now, the tremor that had once accompanied every thought of his name had receded to a place of weathered memory. She walked to the donation box with the measured steps of someone who has decided what to bear and what to lay down. Outside, the wind moved through the town with a sound like a page turned, and somewhere, unseen, the world kept its own counsel. As she let the book go, she felt grief and relief braided together, neither canceling the other but instead making a new pattern. She had expected the act of giving the book away to be a finality, a neat conclusion that would tidy the edges of her story. Instead it was an opening. That night, the question that drifted into the dark was not rhetorical at all but urgent and alive, ringing like a bell in a room with windows open to the sea. If the person you hurt is gone, who do you seek forgiveness from now? It was a question she would keep, and it would keep her in return, not as a chain but as a compass. I watched her return the way tide returns to the shore, inevitable, patient, each step measured by the small gravity of what she carried. The book hugged to her chest felt like a body, the apartment's door closed with the soft click of someone who has lived alone long enough to know the exact decibel of their own inhabitation. She moved through the rooms in a kind of ritual that had nothing theatrical about it, no flurry, no gesture meant to be witnessed, only the slow, private choreography of someone who understands that certain moments are to be held, not performed. Evening had draped the windows in a particular blue that made the city's lights look like lamps in a shallow ocean. The kettle hissed and then subsided, the cat wound itself around her ankles as if offering the crude, uncompromising comfort animals provide. She set the book on the table, not with ceremony but with the attentiveness of someone placing a new kind of thing into a familiar slot. She read the letter once more because one more read felt like honesty. The paper was soft where her fingers had grazed it, the ink had the faint smear of tears left and then dried. The sentences that had seemed so urgent on the first nights now lay in a kind of calm order. There is a particular intimacy in reading your own confessions aloud when you are alone, the voice fractures and mends in ways it never would in company. She spoke the sentences as if tracing a route she had learned by heart, the beginning, the transgression, the apologetic accounting, the declaration of love that had been the stubborn, recurring thread. As she read, the room seemed to tighten its listening, the kettle's silence, the cat's soft breathing, the thin sound of the radiator expanding, all those household noises shaped themselves into a hush you only hear when you are asking a question of yourself. And then she read it as if he were there. She let the cadence lift and fall in the way she remembered his voice doing when he read to her, or when he read to a room that didn't know it needed the story. In her memory, his voice had once folded the world into attention. Speech was what he offered that made ordinary things luminous. She folded his voice into the reading, and it felt less like imagination and more like conjuration. The letter's words, in that imagined utterance, carried a double weight. They were both mine and his, confession and verdict, apology and reply. When she reached the line, "You once told me stories are how we remember love," she let the voice that was not his speak it gently, and then she shifted to what she imagined his voice might add, low and dry and affectionate. "So here's mine, unfinished, but still true." Hearing the words as if from him was not a betrayal of memory, it was a form of translation. The reverse of absence is not presence but the ability to make what is past speak into the present in a way that alters your shape. She imagined him reading the lines with the same tenderness with which he had once annotated margins, careful, exact, like someone touching a fragile instrument to see if it still sings. In that imagined voice, every regret she had held on to softened into a different register. The sentence "I am sorry" broke open and allowed other meanings to come through. "I acknowledge, I see, I am changed." The voice she conjured did not offer absolution like a court pronouncement. It offered recognition. Recognition is sometimes steadier than forgiveness because it requires less of an answer and more of a witness. The climax of her internal conflict did not arrive as drama arranged by fate, it came as an accumulation of small clarities, each one eventually forming a new optic through which to view her life. She had rehearsed endings in so many forms: burning the letter, mailing it, tracking him down, burning the book, giving it away, stashing it in a drawer and forgetting it like any self-protective tactic. Each hypothetical was a test. Would she choose spectacle, secrecy, reenactment, or surrender? The choice that finally presented itself was quieter than any rehearsal had suggested. It asked for a strangely humble courage, not to force him to be present, not to demand an answer, but to accept that her act of writing had already altered her, and that alteration needed to be honored in the world, not hoarded as a private religion. She read again, slower, and when she arrived at the paragraph where she had written about the small magic of their shared rituals, how they used stories to map their love, her throat tightened in the way it does when the body remembers something useful, a reflexive, bodily recognition of truth. Those lines had been written in an attempt to repair, they now read like testimony. The imagined Daniel's voice lingered over the sentence and then continued, the motion of his reading shaping the possibility that had been latent. "We will remember by telling. We will remember by naming. We will remember by being humble enough to keep a page between us if the words themselves become too much." In that conjured utterance there was no theatrical forgiveness demanded, only the simple insistence that stories be honored as the vessels they are. Her hands, which had trembled when she began drafting the letter and when she had toyed with flame, were steadier now. She folded the paper along the same lines she always had, careful, neat, reverent, as if the act of folding itself conferred form on the chaos inside her. She did not seal the envelope with wax or fanfare. Instead she slid it back into the book with the tenderness of someone tucking a beloved thing into a chest. The gesture was both a return and a reconsecration. She had once imagined the book as an archive only of what was lost, but in the quiet now it felt also like a repository for what had been acknowledged and therefore made lighter. Morning arrived without trumpet. The city was ordinary, shopkeepers opened their doors, a bus pushed through the street, a dog yawned and barked into the thin light. Yet for Alara, the morning felt like a hinge. She walked to the bookstore not because the town needed a spectacle but because the donation box there had seemed a steady, sensible receptacle for things meant to be given back to the world. Her steps were not hurried, and she did not look like someone on a mission to fix a past. She looked like someone who had made an ethical choice and was carrying it out like one would carry an umbrella, a practical tool against the weather of oneself. When she reached the bookshop, the donation box stood like a small altar outside the door, wood dulled where hands had previously rested. People passed by and glanced at the box without noticing it was carrying more than paper, it was carrying the weight of decisions. For a moment she hesitated. She could see in her mind 1,000 possible futures, someone opening the book and finding the letter, someone not opening it, someone scanning the marginalia and not understanding, someone seeing Daniel's handwriting, feeling the tremor of connection, and then deciding to return the book to a shelf rather than let it be passed on. Each possibility had within it a story, and for a moment the old habit, of needing the story to resolve in a certain way, asserted itself. Then she did something simple and profoundly brave, she placed the book in the box. It was not dramatic. There were no cameras, no witnesses, only the small slide of paper against cardboard, the soft thud of a cover meeting other covers. That sound was the sound of release. She did not stand and watch as the lid closed, because the point was not to perform the letting go for someone else, it was to enact it on her own behalf. There is a kind of privacy to genuine release, it is less a thing you show and more something you rearrange. As she walked away, something like a smile found its way onto her face. It was almost involuntary, born of the same muscles that had once made a joke with her fingers, the minor upward turn that used to accompany the end of a good paragraph. It was, in truth, the smallest of smiles, the kind that does not declare victory but recognizes a new equilibrium. The town moved about its business as though nothing had been altered, perhaps to the town nothing had. But for Ilara the balance shifted, a load she had carried for years was not gone so much as lightened. You cannot unlove someone, and you cannot unlive what has happened, but you can alter how you carry it. The book's placement into the flow of strangers' hands made her feel less like an island hoarding a relic and more like a seamstress rejoining the fabric where it had frayed. A startling thing happened then, small and ordinary and perfect, as she crossed the street. A gust of wind, sudden and playful, caught the edge of a page that had been tucked too loose in the book's spine. It peeled away and rode the air like a leaf freed from winter. For a moment the paper lifted and fluttered, and she watched it spiral in a small, obedient arc until it dipped and settled on the cobblestone, where some passer-by might notice it days hence or never at all. The page carried her handwriting, ink blurred where rain had kissed it, and for the first time what she had written took on a life entirely outside of her control. A letter, once sealed in privacy, was now subject to chance. The sight of the page lifting and falling felt to her like a finalization of the long process she had been living through, an acknowledgement that once you release something it becomes part of other people's weather. She stood there until the page had been carried past the curb and out of her direct line of sight. The smile left her face but did not vanish, it softened into something like quiet approval. The relief that braided through her was not the cinematic relief of a problem solved with triumphant chords. It was more like the sensation of shedding a heavy coat on a day finally warm enough to go without. There was still pain, there was still memory, there was still the ache that comes with loving someone who is no longer capable of returning your confession in the way you fantasized. But what replaced the chronic, gnawing guilt was a steadier resolve. She felt the old ledger of wrong slide off her back, not erased, but slotted into a different place in her life where it would no longer define every movement. When she reached her apartment again, the room seemed the same but the way she inhabited it was altered. She made tea, not as a ritual of avoidance but as a simple act of tending. She sat by the window and let the light do what light always does, reveal the things you have been overlooking and warm them until they are bearable to look at. In the quiet, she considered the sentence she had placed into the world and the one Daniel had left like a small halo listening at the edge of it. Some letters never need answers. Her confession had been both a demand and a gift, now she understood its true shape. It had been, ultimately, a way to speak to herself, to draw up the map of her culpability and thereby see where she might walk differently. The night that followed was not triumphant. There was no grand reconciliation with the self as one might find in a fable. Instead, there was the steady accrual of ordinary kindnesses she allowed herself, a longer walk in the morning, letting the cat sleep on her chest for a while, writing in her journal not to plead but to note small mercies. The letter remained in the book she had placed into the world, whether it would be found by someone who needed it, or by someone who would discard it, or by someone who would tuck it into their own private archive, was no longer solely her concern. That, in itself, felt like freedom. She had been carrying not just regret but the responsibility for its resolution. By giving the book away, she had allowed fate and strangers in time to play their parts in the unfolding. In her bed that night she turned the thought over as if it were a pebble that had revealed a fossil inside. The action of dropping the book into the box had been small, but it had been decisive. She had chosen the humility of letting the world take part in her private reckoning, and in doing so she had admitted that absolution is sometimes a social, communal phenomenon rather than a private transaction. The smile she had worn on the street came back to her in the dark, softer now, like a lantern with a low flame. She did not imagine she would be entirely different come morning. Guilt has a lingering way of visiting in small, polite ways. But the weight of it had shifted its place in her body. It no longer positioned itself as the axis around which all her motions spun. The wind, the book, the fluttering page, these things were not metaphors she could now unpack with tidy conclusions. They were events, small, messily human, and utterly irreducible to the tidy moral calculus she had once believed in. When she whispered into the dark, the last thing she said was not an apology but an acknowledgement. She had spoken, she had acted, and the rest, whatever shape it would take, would be walked into by days she had yet to live. The letter had been a bridge she had built for herself, and when she let it go she found that crossing had led her somewhere she could not have reached alone. The next morning, when she rose to make tea and open her curtains to a world that remained indifferent and kind, she felt, as she had never allowed herself to feel before, a lightness that was not careless but careful, an attentiveness to living that had room for sorrow and yet welcomed a new kind of breath. When I watched the page ride the wind and settle like a small boat on a shore, I understood the truth of what she had done. When she let it go, she had not lost anything worth keeping, she had shed a weight that the living are not meant to carry forever. When I let it go, I felt the weight leave me too. I have watched more endings than most people imagine exist. Sometimes they arrive like firework finales, loud and deliberate, and sometimes they are quieter, like the slow extinguishing of a lamp when a room has already grown used to shadow. For Ilara, the close of her story did not come as a single, tidy bow. It arrived in pieces that fit together only when viewed from a distance, small acts, soft consequences, the easy, ordinary choreography of people living their lives around what had once felt like a cathedral-sized sorrow. The donation shop became the first altar of this new, quieter phase, a place where gifts are given back to the world, where other people's hands perform a kind of anonymous curatorship. I went there with her in spirit and watched the way the box was opened by staff with careful fingers, how the books were sorted and breathed upon as if to revive whatever narratives slept inside them. The scene was ordinary enough to be believable: volunteers with aprons, a radio playing something old and familiar behind the counter, a cat asleep on a stack of travel guides, sunlight in the window like a benevolent witness. Strangers moved through the aisles with the reverence of people browsing a library of possible selves. Some scanned spines with the mild hunger of a weekend shopper, some lingered over covers as if they were deciding whether to adopt a life. There is a particular tenderness in watching other people touch the same pages you once turned with private hands. The book with her letter, the places we leave behind, settled into the geometry of the shelves among travelogues and domestic memoirs, a small, ordinary object again, its history hidden in plain sight. I saw a woman in a green coat pick it up, her gloves folding against the cover, and flip it open to the front page where a name had been penciled. She held it for a long time, not reading everything but letting the weight of the object rest in her hands. Around her, other patrons did the routine of choosing and discarding with the small finality of people who travel through someone else's artifacts and make the private public by the act of choosing. It was then that a young woman, perhaps 20, perhaps less, walked into the frame of the shop and found the book on the shelf. She cradled it as if it were a fragile animal, turning it over, reading the inscription on the inside cover with a sort of puzzled, tender curiosity. When she noticed an envelope tucked neatly between two of the pages, she paused, and the pause was the kind of thing that seems to expand time. She did not, in that moment, break the seal. There are many reasons for that: caution, respect, a reverence for other people's interior worlds, or maybe an intuitive sense that whatever was inside belonged to a sequence of events that had already moved beyond being merely a curiosity. The young woman held the envelope close to her chest like a secret that smelled faintly of paper and the sea, and turned the book in her hands as if feeling its temperature. From across the street, Elara watched. She had chosen this vantage deliberately, far enough away to be anonymous, near enough that the arc of her experience might intersect with the book's future. The street between them was ordinary: parked cars, a lamppost with a flaked paint, the constant small motion of a town that believes in routine like a religion. She had, in her pocket, the ghost of a smile that felt foreign and honest at the same time. Some stories aren't meant to be read. Just released, she whispered to herself, a line she had rehearsed privately like a benediction. Her voice held no triumph, it held the simple tenderness of someone acknowledging the limits of what must be told. The young woman in the shop glanced up, and for a second their eyes met, two strangers separated by glass and the distance of the street. If there was recognition in that look, it was not of each other but of the shape of the scene: someone surrendering a private relic into the flow of strangers, someone else taking it into custody as if by instinct. Elara's act of release did not erase the past. It rearranged it. Watching the young woman hold the envelope made her feel a curious looseness in her chest, almost like the way a clenched hand opens when someone sets it gently upon a table. She thought of all the possible fates the envelope might meet: it might never be opened, it might be read and then returned to anonymity, it might be carried to a different city and become someone else's ordinary, it might be forgotten in the back of a shelf until the paper yellowed and curled. Each possibility was a small story in itself, and none belonged to her alone. Part of the act of release was conceding that outcomes were not her burden to micromanage. To set a story free is to accept that it will rewrite itself in the hands of others, and that rewriting is not sacrilege but the natural order of narrative life. Walking along the shore later, she felt the ocean's counsel in the way the horizon was patient and the sky refused conclusions. The beach was a place the town used to forget its grief. Here, the gulls argued in high, impatient voices, and the water returned always in the same conservative, obedient rhythm. There were other walkers, couples with dogs, an old man fishing with the kind of solitary focus that looks like religion, a child building a small cathedral of wet sand and hopes. The sound of the tide was a metronome. It counted the days she had been holding herself and then quietly suggested a tempo for stepping down from the pedestal on which she had stood for so long. She walked with her hands in the pockets of her coat, feeling the edge of the envelope pressed there like a relic she was allowed to touch but not unwrap. The sky was the kind that presses color into everything, making the mundane gilded in a light that doesn't lie. She considered forgiveness as an idea and as a practice. Forgiveness, she had once been told, is a conversation. You perform it like a duet, someone else takes the second voice. But when the other voice is gone, what then becomes of the duet? She realized now that forgiveness could be solitary without being solipsistic. It could be a kind of single-player hymn. Saying the words, whether aloud or on a page, did not require an answer to be valid. The validity of an apology is not contingent upon absolution. Sometimes it is a ritual you do for your own bones, to settle them, to reduce the heat in your hands. She sat on a bench facing the sea and whispered into the wind the line she had learned to live by: forgiveness isn't about being heard. It's about finally speaking, even if no one ever answers. The phrase was both balm and test. Speaking seemed, in the end, to be what she owed to the life she had lived and to the person she had been upon the receiving end of her choices. As she walked, she noticed small things she had once overlooked: a child jumping over a puddle with a courage she envied, a woman humming a tune imperfectly and with abandon, an old couple that held hands as if their fingers were conducting electricity. The world seemed content to keep its pulse whether she carried guilt or not. There is a humility in that. The universe does not stop to adjudicate every human misstep. It keeps on with weather and seasons and stale coffee and the quiet gestures of routine. To live among such continuity is to be offered, whether you accept it or not, a chance for reintegration. Elara began to feel that reintegration like a slow warming at the edge of her ribs, not the overwrought kind of redemption novels often afford, but the softer, more tenuous kind that comes from accepting the texture of one's days again. At home that evening she made soup and left it simmering enough to think about without being forced into action. She lit a candle, not to burn the letter now, but to make a small effort to be present to the ordinary. The cat hopped onto her lap and looked at her with the imperious attention of creatures who know exactly where they belong in human grief. She opened her journal, not the letter but the blank one she kept for margins, and wrote a sentence that had been living just under the skin of her thoughts. I have spoken. I have tried. Let others hold what I could not. The act of writing this felt less like erasure and more like cataloging. She was not making a confession to a world that would punish less or more, she was declaring a change in posture. Previously, her life had been a ledger of offenses and contrition, now she wanted it to be a map showing where she could go and whom she could be on the other side of regret. Sometimes closure takes the form of ritual, sometimes it takes the form of tiny, steadfast practices. Elara began the small work of living with intention. She returned books to the library with a punctuality she had not known before. She smiled at the neighbors not out of obligation but because it felt like a muscle she wanted to exercise. She allowed herself to write small pieces that never made it past the first paragraph for no reason other than that the act of starting felt like a promise. The open letter, the book in the donation box, and the young woman who had not opened the envelope, they were all part of a constellation that guided how she practiced this new life. The constellation did not remove the constellations of regret, it simply placed them in a context where stars can move without annihilating each other. Night after night she would fall asleep with a thought like this held close, that the most honest thing one can do after making harm is to live so that harm does not continue to define the shape of one's days. There was an ethical clarity in that resolution that did not require applause. It asked for nothing beyond small, steady repair. She thought of Daniel often, but always in a gentler register now. The edges of memory had softened into a portrait she could look upon without being cut by it. She began to read his marginalia differently, not as accusing evidence but as the scattered flourishes of a life that had once touched hers and left ink as its echo. She realized that love leaves traces not only in grand gestures but in the quiet ways people annotate the world. The final tableau that closed the arc was a simple one. The envelope, loosened by the wind, had made its way from the spine of the book and fallen down onto the stones by the shore of someone else's story. Maybe no one ever read it. Maybe someone did and kept the words like a small talisman in a coat pocket. Or perhaps it became a forgotten scrap fluttering under a bench until rain blurred its letters utterly. It did not matter. What mattered was that the letter, once a thing she had hoarded like contraband, had entered into the common weather of life. It floated. It blurred. It became part of the world's small inventory of lost and found. As a narrator I have stitched many threads into a fabric that will be seen by a reader who wants the assurance of shape. But life, I know, does not always furnish narrative the way we prefer. It is messy and beautiful and stubborn. The end of Elara's particular arc did not resolve all riddles. Some questions persisted, practical things about how to live with memory and how to be gentle without becoming complacent, but the most important questions softened into company. She carried them not like weights but like questions one keeps in conversation, not always answered, but never entirely abandoned. She walked away from the shore with the taste of salt and the old, unmistakable flavor of relief. It was not jubilation, it was the plain relief of a burden shifted, the difference between carrying a pack and having it set down on a porch. She would, of course, continue to ache. Love and regret are not the sorts of things that leave you entirely. But she had given herself a new story in which to live, one that included apology, memory, and also the gentle courage of release. The final image that remains is not cinematic so much as quietly whole, the ink blurring as the tide laps at paper, the letters running together into something indecipherable and therefore freed from the strictures of demand. When ink blurs into water, the words become weather. They are no longer commands placed upon another person but elements returned to the world. Forgiveness, she learned, is not always about being heard or having the echo of your confession bounce back in human words. Sometimes it is a private, sacramental act. Sometimes it is the way you begin to arrange your life so that the act of harm does not determine your orientation. And sometimes it is simply speaking, knowing full well that silence may answer you. The last time I saw her, she stood by the window with a cup of tea gone cool and mouthed the line as if blessing the room. Forgiveness isn't about being heard. It's about finally speaking, even if no one ever answers. The sentence was not a finale so much as a practice she intended to repeat. It would not erase what had been done, but it would, in small, recurrent acts, change how she bore it. The page that had once carried the confession dissolved into the tide and was carried somewhere unknown. The shape of the confession remained, though, in the quiet geometry of her days, and that, perhaps, is what it means to let go, not to forget but to allow the story to become, at last, someone else's weather. The screen fades to black, and for a moment there is only the sound of paper, the whisper of a page turning somewhere in the dark. Then the piano begins, soft and deliberate, like rain returning to a roof it remembers. My voice comes in low, steady, the way you speak to someone who's been listening for a long time. If this story has found you, stay for a moment before you move on. Let the quiet settle. Think about the words you've left unsaid, the ones that live between the lines of your days, waiting for the courage of your handwriting. We all have them, the apologies never sent, the thank yous that came too late, the I miss yous that stayed caught in the throat. They gather in us like old letters in drawers, softening with time but never quite disappearing. Ask yourself, who would you write to if you had one last letter? Not to change the past, not to fix what can't be fixed, but to speak into the silence that still hums between you. Maybe it's someone you lost. Maybe it's someone still here but drifting just far enough that the words have become heavy. You don't need the right address. You don't even need them to read it. Some letters are written not to arrive, but to release. Don't wait for forgiveness. It's a door that sometimes never opens, and that's all right. What matters is that you knock, that you speak the truth that has been pressing against the edges of your heart. Say it aloud. Write it down. Leave it somewhere, even if no one ever finds it. The act of speaking is the act of freeing. The silence you break might be your own. Forgiveness, as Alara learned, isn't about being heard. It's about finally speaking, even if the world never echoes back. Your voice, even in its quietest form, carries weight. Let it out. The wind will take it where it needs to go. The music swells slightly now, a piano note held like breath, then fading. The screen darkens completely, until there's only text, white against black, clean, final, true. More stories like this. Subscribe to CineVerse Stories. A pause, not an ending, just the space where another story might begin. And then the sound of the page again, a single page turning, closing the chapter, leaving behind the soft question that lingers after the credits fade. What story would you tell, if someone finally listened?